Hi, this is Mr. Lawrence here, and we're now getting to the new learning. So, for this fourth marking period, we're going to be learning about the Civil War. And before we get to the individual notes, there's a couple things I want to talk to you about with the Civil War. First, the Civil War is the greatest and most important event in American history, and definitely the most tragic. You have 600,000 men, young men, killing each other on the battlefields all across this country. And if you look at a chart of the casualties in the war, 600,000 died in the Civil War compared to 400,000 in World War II, and then compared to 100,000 or less in all the other wars combined. And if you consider the population back then was 30 million people compared to now, which is 330 million people, 11 times larger. So it was a great chunk of the population, almost an entire generation of young men were drafted into it, were traumatized, and if they didn't die, they might have been wounded or diseased. Secondly, the cause of the Civil War was something we've been talking about a lot. It was slavery. I know there are people that say that the main cause of the war was states' rights, but the main state right was slavery. So you have the South rebel in order to keep their slaves. And the vice president of this new southern country, which breaks off, which is going to be called the Confederacy, says at the very beginning that the cornerstone of their new country opposite that of the United States, rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great truth. At the very beginning, they're saying that this new southern country was based on the fact that whites were superior to blacks and that slavery was normal. You have in the Confederate Constitution, they literally copy the United States Constitution almost word for word, except on the two issues of you're allowed to have Negro slaves and no law can ever be passed stopping that, and you're allowed to take your slaves into any new territory as well. So right at the beginning, that's included in their country. And by rebelling against the United States, they're essentially creating and fomenting treason. Treason is the only crime that's documented in the United States Constitution. And it says word for word that treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Now, the other thing we have to reckon with is the fact that there were many Confederate soldiers who were simply young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, who didn't own slaves themselves, who might have grown up poor, might have been drafted into it or forced into fighting, and they fought bravely and honorably and suffered just as much as their counterparts in the Union. So how do we honor them and recognize them while at the same time understanding that their cause was wrong? Well, Ulysses S. Grant, who was the eventual head commander of the Union, tried to say that these two thoughts could exist side by side. He says, I don't even feel like celebrating after they had won. He says, I can't celebrate at the downfall of a foe who fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause, though that cause was, I believe, one of the worst for which a people ever fought, and one for which there was the least excuse. So Grant said, I understand their soldiers suffered. I understand it was horrible. But at the end of the day, their army murdered 300,000 soldiers of the United States Army. And we live in Pennsylvania. We live in Pottstown. The Southern Army was responsible for the deaths of so many United States Army soldiers. And it is also true that people have ancestors on both sides of this conflict. I myself have a Union general as my great-great-great-grandfather, General Samuel C. Lawrence of Massachusetts. But at the same time, I also have a Confederate general, General William W. Gordon II of Georgia. So in both my lines there, I have Confederates and I have Union soldiers. So I have to live with that. I have to grapple with that, as do many families in their histories. Now, going towards the notes and today's specific slides, I want to make sure that you take notes. You need to have this down just like we did during school, because eventually you'll have a quiz on it. So the heading is going to be Unit 7, Civil War Era, 1860 to 1865. So on a piece of paper, notebook, scrap paper, computer, you can type this down at the top. We are not going to be able to get to Unit 8, Reconstruction Era, as much as I wanted. But the Civil War, like I said, is the pivotal turning point in American history. We have to make sure we get that. Even if it's in this weird online learning, I want to make sure that you guys have that before you go to high school. This picture here is of the surrender at the very end of the war. But we have a long way to go to get to this point where the South surrenders to the North. If we go back to what the country was like in 1860, remember that the issue again was these new states coming in and how many free states there would be versus how many slave states there were going to be. At this point, there are 18 free states and there are 15 slave states. And the entire debate is going to be all this new territory out here, all this area that is not red or blue, is it going to allow slavery there or not? And you have people on opposite sides arguing one way or the other. In the South, you have this new group of radicals called the Fire Eaters. It's an interesting name. And these Fire Eaters were more loyal to their state than they were the United States. They believed that their state was their country. They said that if they had to choose between one of them, they would choose their state. They would choose Virginia. They would choose Florida over the United States. Heck, Virginia had been around for 250 some years almost, while the United States had only been around for 80 years. And that was their home. That was where they were most loyal. And they said if they couldn't expand slavery, they're willing to pack up and leave the United States. And they're willing to do that preemptively, meaning before any law would be passed, they saw the writing on the wall and they saw that there might be more free states in the future, and they're willing to just leave instead of be part of it. On the other side, you have a new political party that is claiming their heritage is part of the Founding Fathers. They said the Founding Fathers never meant for slavery to exist forever. They just punted it to their grandchildren and future generations, and maybe eventually it would die off. But they surely didn't mean for it to expand and go on forever. And this new party is called the Republican Party. And this Republican Party is the same one that exists nowadays. So this is when they're created in 1854. And it's created in the North after the Whig Party folds. And their main goal is to try to stop slavery from expanding. So all that new land that I showed you, they want to make sure that slavery doesn't go out there. They're not saying that slavery has to be banned where it is now, like the abolitionists want, people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. They're just saying that they don't want to see slavery go anywhere else. They said slavery was like a cancer. It was like a disease. They didn't want it to spread because once it spread, it could go to Mexico, it could go to Cuba, it could go up to California, it could go up to New York, it could go anywhere. And the Republicans get as their leader a little-known backwoods lawyer, very crafty politician by the name of Abraham Lincoln. And Lincoln was only a congressman for 2 years, and in fact, he'd been out of office for 12 years. But he spent that time honing his arguments, getting supporters, getting friends, giving speeches, having debates, writing letters in newspapers, and focusing on this argument that we should not expand slavery. And I'll go back to this slide in a second. But Lincoln gives this famous quote where he says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it to be cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it," meaning him, "or its supporters will push it forward till it shall become lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south." So Lincoln is able to excite the North, excite the West, and get them united behind his candidacy, and he is going to be elected president in 1860. He is so hated in the South, however, he is not even allowed to be on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. So, what is the South going to do? They did not support him, and they were worried about what he might do, even though he had specifically said he was not going to ban slavery in the South. He just wanted to stop it from going anywhere else. Well, what the South does is they pack up and quit before Lincoln can even become president. There's 4 months in between Lincoln being elected in November and when he becomes president in March. So during that time, they quit. That's called the Secession crisis. The first state to quit or secede is South Carolina. They're followed by 10 more states, followed by Mississippi and Florida and Georgia and Alabama and Louisiana and Texas and Arkansas and Tennessee and North Carolina and Virginia. And those states say that we are going to leave the United States. They say the United States, we never signed up for this to be permanent, and we're packing up and going home and going to create our own culture, our own society, our own laws, which we saw earlier, will make sure that slavery is always allowed. And they are going to form their own new country called, wait for it, the CSA, as opposed to the USA, the Confederate States of America. This new country, formed by the 11 southern states, elect Jefferson Davis as their president. You can see the states outlined here in red. And they are saying to the United States, you're a foreign country, we're our own country, we're making our own laws, we're doing our own thing. Lincoln and the United States say, no, you're illegitimate. There's no part of the Constitution that says you can just get up and leave whenever you feel like. It's one country. And you're breaking the law, you're being traitors, you're committing treason, and you have to come back. And that's going to eventually set the stage for the first part of this war. So in February, you have Davis and the CSA government being sworn into power in Montgomery, Alabama. And then hundreds of miles to the north, you have Lincoln in March in Washington, D.C., being sworn into power. You have two countries side by side with the same language, a lot of the same history, a lot of the same culture, same religion, same heritage, but divided over this issue of slavery and its future. Lincoln gives one final plea here. He says, please don't go. He says, we're not the ones creating this conflict. He says, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained it, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature. Little did he know about the hell of 4 years of fighting that was going to come.